So you okay? Can you go on? Get him a body bag! Yeah! All right. Feet. Hell yeah! Hell yeah!
Hey everybody, how are you doing, Truth Seekers? Happy 2020. Hope you're having a great year. If you're joining us for the first time, please check out the links on all the different places you can subscribe to this content. What content, you might ask? I was talking to someone the other day who referred me to an article about a new telescope, like the Hubble, but with much more magnifying ability. Will actually be able to look so far into the universe that it can help us detect, kind of like tree rings, how old the universe is and how its genesis unfolded. And me, having the giant ego that I do, I thought that's a lot like my show. That's what we do. When everyone is talking about impeachment and the never-ending circus, we talk about how we got here and what we can learn from it. And today's going to be no exception. I got a great guest. And before I bring him on, I'm going to read an excerpt from the book that we're discussing. It has to do with the North versus the South. This is in the introduction. It kind of lays, the hammer hits you pretty hard. Here we go. It's all very simple. The establishment historian writes, the Civil War was all about slavery. Check. The selfless and morally superior Union soldier, brilliantly directed by a prophet and saint, Abraham Lincoln, invaded the evil and decadent South with no other purpose than to liberate oppressed and downtrodden Negro from his cruel, sadistic masters. Filled with righteous indignation, these virtuous knights in military blue crushed the traitors and brought emancipation and heaven on earth to African Americans, all while bringing defeat and chastisement to the poor, ignorant Southerners, most of whom were slave owners or cruel overseers who wiped their noses on their shirt sleeves and chewed tobacco, even the women. The book is It Wasn't About Slavery. The author is Dr. Samuel W. Mitcham, Jr., the author of over 40 books focusing on issues and ideas that you should know. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but he might be one of those poor, ignorant Southerners who chews tobacco and wipes them on. Dr. Mitcham, sorry, I forgot. Hey, is that an accurate description of you growing up in Monroe, Louisiana?
Well, I didn't grow up in Monroe. I grew up in Marouge, which is about 700 people. And it was a good rural upbringing. I learned a lot of values and later became an Army officer, helicopter pilot back in the Vietnam thing. I'm very satisfied with my Southern upbringing.
So that's an unfair description of the Southerners, because as I read through your book, I think you've got a point when you talk about history is written by the victors. A lot of what I read in here, a lot of what I've been exposed to in the last few years by people like yourself, and I had Brion McClanahan on about a year ago when his book came out, and I felt a little bit icky, a little bit uncomfortable trashing Abraham Lincoln, because he was a prophet, he was a saint, he was the emancipator. So where did we go wrong? How did we get here?
Well, Abraham Lincoln was not a saint. He was a slick politician. In the Transcontinental Railroad, he certainly was corrupt in that. He helped enrich himself. He bought some land up at Council Bluffs, Iowa, and then made sure that the Transcontinental Railroad's eastern terminus was in Council Bluffs, Iowa. I don't know how much he made off that, but it was handsome. He was a brilliant corporate attorney, and he was a slick politician. But he would do things for political expediency. He wasn't the tremendously sainted person, demigod he's made out to be today. He a little bit strange sometimes. For example, his son died, and on 2 occasions he had the coffin exhumed so he could look at the body again. I mean, that's a little odd. But Lincoln would do things for expediency. For example, he called him the emancipator. Actually, there were 2 emancipation proclamations issued during the Civil War. The first one was on August 30th, 1861, by General John Fremont, who commanded the Union forces in Missouri. Within 72 hours of its being issued, it was revoked by Abraham Lincoln. And shortly thereafter, he fired General Fremont. And he would have probably revoked the emancipation earlier, except August 30th was a Friday. so it was a weekend. He issued it, as he himself said, for military expediency. The war wasn't going well, and he would like the slaves to revolt, and that would take Confederate forces away from the front and create a military advantage for the North. He underestimated the African Americans of that day. They weren't as stupid as he seemed to think, because they knew that if they revolted, they would be facing regular Confederate forces who were, generally speaking, pretty well armed. And they'd be facing them with hatchets and pitchforks, and it would not have gone well for them. So they didn't revolt. Other reasons for the Emancipation Proclamation was strictly strategic. He was afraid Britain and France might join the Confederacy, and if they had, the result of the war would most likely have been quite different.
Let's,
But,
Doctor,
he knew
let's,
that the lower
let's,
class.
I was going to say
Go
that
ahead.
I want to talk about the election of 1860 and some of the theories about Abraham Lincoln. But before we do that, for people unfamiliar with the book, and I recommend you guys go out and pick it up. It's not a long read. You can probably finish it over a week or 2 week period if you're a casual reader like myself. But you lay the groundwork really impressively. So can we go back a little bit before we get into the politics of Abraham Lincoln's tenure? You start off the book by talking about the hypocrisy of the North. And you put your theory out there that you don't even believe it was a civil war by definition. Civil wars have certain technicalities that have to be met for that name to apply. And so let's just cover kind of the overall themes of hypocrisy and the slavery and the Yankee flesh peddler. I learned a lot in these first 2 chapters. So kind of give us an overview of how the North was a little bit hypocritical in claiming that the South was the slave part of the nation once the Civil War came around.
Well, the North entered slavery early and left when the Age of Enlightenment began. The South started a little late, but I think eventually would have, as the editors of the day said, eventually they would have ended slavery themselves. It's not generally known, but Massachusetts had slavery 78 years longer than did Mississippi. In 1703, 42% of New York City households owned slaves, and that was more than any city in the North American hemisphere except Charleston, South Carolina. As late as 1750, there were 3 times as many slaves in Connecticut as Georgia, and Massachusetts had 4 times as many. The South entered, and the Northerners were pretty tough on their black people. Connecticut, in 1708, passed a law stating that any black person who even attempted to strike a white person for any reason would receive 30 lashes. And that wasn't good enough for them. 22 years later, they passed a law upping it to 40 lashes for even speaking against a white person. And that continued. In 1862, Lincoln had been president for a year. They had a constitutional vote in Illinois. The Constitutional Convention had met. And Article 18 said that no mulatto or Negro would be allowed to settle in the state from the passage of that amendment. Now, it was put on the ballot separate from the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln supported Amendment 18. He wanted to restrict blacks from moving to Illinois, actually prevent them. And the amendment passed by over 100,000 votes. The Constitution itself was defeated by around 16,000 votes. So that kind of flies in the face of what is conventionally known as history. I hope I answered your question.
No, you did. And you also made the argument that the North, economically, we talk about how slavery was an agricultural outfit that really depended on the slave trade. But your argument is that the ships and the slave trade and the laws that basically ensured that there was profitability in the slave trade were all Northern principles and policies. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. The North realized very quickly that there was a lot of profit in slavery. You've got to look at the finances. I found a book by Theodore Conneau. He was a French and Italian young man. His daddy was killed at Waterloo. He had to go to sea, and he got involved in the slave business. He worked in it for 20 years. His book's called 20 Years of Slavery. And he finally got enough money to buy his own slave ship. And I put the finances in the book. He was good enough to break it down by $1. And he made a gross profit of over $71,000. But his net profit from one slave ship, one trip, was $41,000 in 1827. And that would be $916,000 in today's money, according to the Morgan Freeman inflation calculator. So there was a huge amount of money in this, and that motivated the North. They set up what was called the triangle trade. They would take ships. The center of the slave trade was never Charleston or Savannah. There were no slavers operating out of there. They operated out of Boston and Providence, Rhode Island, later joined by New York City and Portland, Maine. And they'd load their ships with rum, and they'd sail to Africa and sell the rum for slaves. So they would get a typical slave would be purchased for 200 gallons of rum. And they put the slaves on the slave ship and take them to the New World. 94% of those slaves went to countries other than the United States. Only 6% came to the USA. And they'd sell the slaves for gold and molasses. Then they would go back to New England and sell the molasses to the rum distillers, of which there were about 200, mainly in Rhode Island, Connecticut. And they'd convert it to rum, and then they'd have another trip back to Africa with the rum, and they'd just keep repeating it. You had 3 legs and made profit every time, and they got rich. And continued to do so. Even after the Civil War, a lot of areas were restricted from the slave trade, including the United States. But Brazil, for example, was the last country to abolish the slave trade. That happened 20 years after Lee surrendered. So the northern flesh peddlers continued to make money off the slave trade till 1885, 20 years after the war. So, it can't, this, what I call the noble cause delusion disorder, doesn't stand up to close scrutiny. Lincoln and his minions could have moved against the slave trade, but it would have offended a lot of very important rich people in New England, so they didn't do it.
Let's start transitioning to what the events that happened that led to slavery becoming a platform of the Republican Party, a primary, because you argue that it really wasn't for forever until it was politically convenient. When I read about it, it kind of reminded me of LBJ, flipping on civil rights, which made me a little sad, but I want to explore that. So as you go on in the book, you talk about the constitutional questions. I really enjoyed this chapter. I wish it had been a little longer, but in terms of secession, you make the argument that the Civil War, and you should define your terms of Civil War in this answer, but you talk about how secession was part of the Constitution. It was essentially a protected right and an agreed on term, but that's not how it panned out.
Well, the Declaration of Independence, in my view, was the most beautiful ordinance of secession ever written. The United States was born of secession, and they tried in the Articles of Confederation to make a perpetual union where you could not secede. But the Articles of Confederation didn't work, and despite what it said, that it was a perpetual union, every state seceded from the Articles, and they wrote the Constitution. And the perpetual union part was conspicuous by its absence. Matter of fact, in their ratification documents for the Constitution, New York, Virginia, and Rhode Island all specified they had the right to secede. And nobody questioned that. What was it Shelby Foote said? I think he put it very well. If they'd known they couldn't get out, they never would have gotten in.
And you argued that several states early on threatened secession pretty much constantly, right? And they got close several times, which I didn't know.
Yeah, there was no period in American history where secession wasn't talked about, at least to some degree, sometimes more seriously than others. But the New England Concord Convention met, and they openly debated secession, and it looked like they were going to do it because they weren't satisfied with the War of 1812. You know, they didn't do it, but they didn't do it for practical reasons. It had nothing to do with constitutional issues. Everybody agreed they had the right to secede. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, everybody was dissatisfied with Jefferson up in New England. They didn't want him elected. They called him the first Negro president because black people who could not vote were still counted as 3/5 of a person for electoral purposes. And if they had been counted as not a person, John Adams would have been reelected because he would have had more electoral votes. So
somewhere Bill Clinton is shedding a tear.
Jefferson just told them, if you want to secede, go in peace.
Go in peace. And you mentioned is this chapter builds that West Virginia actually seceded just prior to the election, which helped swing the election, and nobody was against it at that time. Kind of dive into that a little bit. Was it Lincoln who allowed that to happen?
Oh, Lincoln was all for it. He wanted the electoral votes, and he knew the mountainous people in West. Lincoln was in trouble for re-election in 1864 before Atlanta fell. The northern population have what I call the spirit of Bull Run. You know, Bull Run, the first battle of the war, 1861. Both sides figured they'd whoop the other with no problem at all, and the war would be over in 90 days. Well, it didn't work that way. Both sides suffered heavy losses. And the North in 1864 had a relapse of the spirit of Bull Run. I mean, they won at Gettysburg. They destroyed a whole Confederate army at Vicksburg. They smashed the Confederate army at Chattanooga. They thought the Confederate army was just going to be a pushover in 1864. They thought it was shattered, demoralized remnants, and the whole operation would just be a little mopping up operation. And instead, Lee's army inflicted more casualties on Grant's army than Lee had in his entire army. And everybody knew somebody who had either been killed or was missing or lost a limb. And the Northern public opinion turned on Lincoln. And he himself said he thought he was going to lose re-election. And that all changed with the fall of Atlanta because after that, the North could see that the light at the end of the tunnel, they were going to win the war. So they voted to re-elect Lincoln.
Even at my spry young age, even at my spry young age, you've got a few more years on me. This pattern seems somewhat familiar. War will end quickly. President will be happy. People will be prosperous. It doesn't really work out that way. And then we start factoring war tactics into our election strategy. I'm curious. I mentioned it once or twice. Talk about your definition of the Civil War. You think that the Civil War is actually a misnomer for the conflict that we had here in the country. Why is that?
Well, globally, as a general rule, the military academies of the world define a civil war as a struggle between two or more factions for control of the government. The objective of the South was never to control the U.S. government. If you believe it's a civil war, you've got to believe that people like Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson wanted to take over and rule places like Chicago and Detroit and Baltimore and New York City. And not even the harshest detractors of these men ever said that. Lincoln defined it as a civil war to provide moral cover for his regime, which I can understand, but technically it was not a civil war. It was a war of self-determination, in my view. I mean, if it's good enough for Bosnia-Herzegovina, why isn't it good enough for Alabama and Mississippi? So that's why I don't like the term Civil War particularly. I use it, but with that caveat.
Let's talk about the cultural differences, economic, socioeconomic, developmental differences, things that were going on that maybe people aren't aware of in terms of cultural differences between the North and the South that contributed to this. We've already made the argument the North actually had a huge stake in slavery. In your book, you argue that the Republican Party platform opposed the expansion of slavery, but they certainly did not embrace abolition, at least not in the long run-up to the Civil War. So as we get to the chapters about cultural differences and the chasm growing, kind of give us some of the highlights of what happened during that process.
Well, one of the major issues of the war, which is never heard of today, was the issue of what kind of government are we going to have. And it's not talked about today because it's a dead issue. It was decided at Appomattox. But before that, you had the Hamiltonians, which Lincoln embraced. Henry Clay embraced it. They called it the American system. And the Jeffersonians. Jefferson believed in governs best which governs least. And Hamilton wanted a strong central government. He wanted a chief executive with almost royal powers. He wanted a Senate elected for life. He wanted a corporate state. He wanted a big national bank which controlled the currency, and of course it would be in New York.
Sounds like he got most of what he wanted eventually.
He did. He did.
He
wanted high tariffs to protect northern industries as they developed. He wanted high land prices out in the West. Because, if the immigrants coming from Europe had low land prices, they'd buy farms, they'd become farmers in the rural areas. But if the prices of land were too high for these people, they would have to stay in the cities and work for the northern corporations and the industrialists. And because the industrialists would have a large unemployed base, they could hire them for $2 a day.
Interesting.
And increase their profits. So, yeah, there was a monetary factor and all that.
So, and then you mentioned there's a chapter when you're talking about the run-up where you mentioned tariffs. And tariffs have been a hot point here lately. I was on the radio with a guy who used to be on before Rush for years and years. And he was just talking about how great it is that we've got these tariffs. And I said, you realize tariffs are just a tax on consumers, right? And we argued about it on the air. And so when you wrote about the Tariff of 1816, you also talk about the amount of prejudice there was in the North for blacks, which is why the population decline of blacks in the North occurred. So I learned some things here. But you even talked about the, what was the guy's name? C. Knott, a Connecticut professor at Harvard. Some of the things they said about blacks. Ralph Waldo Emerson said some things that would get him canceled today. And that the North eventually became addicted to protective tariffs because we didn't have the punitive income tax at the time. Talk about what tariffs did to the separate economies and how that affected the run-up to the war.
Well, the South in 1860 was paying $70 million in tariff taxes and to the federal government. And that accounted for over 82% of federal revenues. Whole federal budget that year was only $80 million, $70 million paid by the South. And the North wanted to increase the tariffs. And that would have had a disastrous effect on the South. In fact, as soon as the Deep South seceded and their senators went home, the North passed the Morrill tariff, supported by Abraham Lincoln, which increased the rates from 24% to 47%. And that was a factor in the secession of the Upper South. It would have, and of course, the Confederacy came into existence, and they set their tariff rate at 10%. They figured if 10% was good enough for God, it was good enough for them. and you can imagine. I mean, if you were an English exporter, where would you take your ship? To Boston or New York, where the tax is 47%? Or maybe to Charleston or Savannah, where it's 10%? Well, that's a no-brainer. And it's rather interesting to read the northern newspapers of the day. You know, when South Carolina seceded, a lot of the newspapers adopted the attitude of General Scott, let our erring brothers leave in peace. And some of the other newspapers said good riddance. They were glad to see South Carolina go. But the northern editors were button-hooked by the corporate owners, the movers and shakers, the industrialists. And they realized if this was allowed to stand, the northern shipping industry would be dead. And northern economy would go into a depression because it couldn't afford, it couldn't compete with the South. I mean, 47% tax against 10%. It's kind of a no-brainer.
Talk to us. Oh, sorry, I was going to say, talk to us about, as we lead up to the war. I'm just getting into chapter 9, which is called John Brown, Terrorist and the Lightning Rod. What happens in that chapter?
Well, John Brown was a terrorist. He attacked Harper's Ferry. He once set up a slave revolt. And he was also a very poor regional geographer. If you were going to start a slave revolt, you want to go where the slaves were treated rougher. I mean, like the rice fields of South Carolina, that's tough work. You would probably get some recruits, some of the cotton fields, tobacco fields in Virginia. Harper's Ferry was a mountainous area, and the few slaves that were there were domestic servants. They weren't ready to rebel. Anyway, it was put down by Colonel Robert E. Lee, and some of Brown's people escaped. And the ones who went to states with Democratic governors were extradited, taken back to Virginia and hanged. The Republican governors wouldn't extradite the Brown terrorist. And you got to understand, the South, more than anything, feared a slave revolt. Haiti, they had a slave revolt. A lot of those people escaped with nothing but their clothes. They went to the South and told tales of rape and murder and slaughter, babies killed in their cribs. And that sent shockwaves throughout the South. And from then on, about 1791 forward, the South feared a slave revolt more than anything.
And just to be clear, I read that section of the book. This was the slave revolters in Haiti coming to the South and killing and murdering white families who did respond in kind. But that's what you're talking about. They just didn't want to see that ever. So that's why they responded so fiercely to any type of revolt.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that your argument?
Well, yes, and when the Republican governors would not extradite the terrorists, the South began to publicly question, their leaders did, what a Republican president would do. With John Brown, the Democratic president, Buchanan responded immediately. They summoned the best officer available that very day they heard about it. His name was Robert E. Lee, and suppressed it quickly. They asked aloud, would a Republican president do the same thing? And the answer, they decided, was no. They could not count on protection from the U.S. president. And a lot of people decided then if Republicans was elected, they would favor secession. People like Stonewall Jackson was a Unionist. And he flipped after Lincoln was elected, and a great many others. Jefferson Davis never advocated secession until after John Brown.
And you said the word unionist. This is a term that we used to use before the Civil War. We called it, Brion McClanahan always said that, a union of states. We didn't call it a nation or a country. It was a union of states. But after the Civil War, that union became locked, and now we're a nation. And I always wonder with the Olympics and their national procedures and policies and just the way people are educated, if no one ever talks about secession anymore unless they're from Texas, if that would ever become a thing. I want you to touch on, so we're running out of time here. I want you to talk about, let's go back to Lincoln. Let's talk about the politics of 1860 and 1864. Let's talk about slavery on the Republican platform and how Lincoln kind of survived the things that he went through and how our slavery approach evolved over time. And also mention black codes. I didn't know much about black codes till I read your book. That was interesting to me also. So kind of run it down for us.
Oh, well, I'm glad you did. Slavery was, the Republicans did not want black people coming to the Midwest, what was then called the Northwest, to the far West, to compete with white people for jobs. Obviously, you don't have to pay a slave anything. Who's going to win the labor contest? Somebody you're going to have to pay, or somebody who'll work for free? And the Northerners didn't want to have to compete with that kind of job market, and they didn't want black people to come into their territory. I mean, it wasn't just because they were black; it's financial, and that may make sense to you. Kind of like graduate students. They teach a lot of classes in college because you don't have to pay a grad student very much.
Yeah, it's the whole intern, the politicians who argue that interns should get paid, and they found out none of their interns were getting paid. That sort of thing, right?
Exactly.
Human behavior.
But there was no great love for black people. Joel Pyatt, who was Abraham Lincoln's military advisor, said Lincoln didn't care any more about black people than the mule he worked or the hog he killed. And he was a smart man, but he was not a modern-day civil rights marcher either. He was product of his time. And the civil rights movement evolved much later. To equate him with Martin Luther King is comparing apples and oranges. Lincoln may have was good at certain things, especially politics, but he wasn't a saint on earth.
Yeah, in the book you mentioned that I think it was it Frederick Douglass actually referred to him as the white man's president. And I might have my timeline mixed up, but I know Frederick Douglass said some really positive things about Lincoln. I don't know if it was before or after what was this, about 1862, because he had advocated for the removal of slaves and to send them to expatriate them back to their countries, which Thomas Jefferson had also advocated. So,
well, Lincoln, for many years, at least a dozen, was secretary of the Illinois branch of the American Colonialization Society, which advocated sending black people back to Africa, whether they had been born here or not. And Lincoln advocated compensated emancipation so that the Southern slave owners wouldn't lose any money. And he offered the federal government to pay for their transportation back to Africa to boot. And with perfect hindsight, you make the case the South should have taken him up on it. But that was Henry Clay was also in that group. President Madison, Chief Justice Marshall. Send them back to Africa was the solution. You've also got to remember the North freed their slaves, but they did it by manumission. It was carefully designed so that the slave owner didn't lose money. It worked this way. You picked a day of manumission, a day you freed your slaves. And if a slave was born before the manumission day, he was a slave forever, unless master released him or he escaped.
So the argument for manumission is it's not really an altruistic move unless you're the person financially benefiting from the manumission.
Well, you know, like if you were my slave and you were 16, you'd be manumitted when you were 24 or 21. Right? You could be pretty confident that the massa would sell you before that time. He'd sell you south, and you'd celebrate that 21st birthday in a cotton field in Georgia or maybe a rice field in South Carolina.
Interesting. Well,
they didn't lose money.
Ladies and gentlemen, the book is It Wasn't About Slavery. I have really enjoyed it thus far. Dr. Mitcham, I do want to ask you about your time as a helicopter pilot because of what happened recently with Kobe Bryant. But before I do, is there any, give us another compelling reason. What else are we going to learn about Abraham Lincoln and his political expertise with regards to slavery? Because you made the bold claim that no political party advocated freeing the slaves in the presidential election of 1860. So just a couple of years before the Civil War, it wasn't even on the table. There was no Medicare for all. So explain.
No, the North, the leaders, the movers and shakers, the people that financed the Republican Party, they knew that, well, I'm making another bold statement for you.
Excellent.
They considered the abolitionists irresponsible. If you freed the slaves in the South immediately, it would cause the collapse of the cotton economy, which would destroy the federal government's ability to pay for whatever it was engaged in doing. Because remember, over 82% of the revenue from the federal government came from the South. And that revenue would disappear. Slavery disappeared instantly.
Did you say 82%? That is a bold statement. That sounds wildly high.
No, actually, it's the budget was $80 million, and $70 million of it came from the South. Now, not all of that would have gone away with the abolition of slavery, but I bet you about half of it would. And you know, you'd have a huge deficit, and they would not be able to pay for things like subsidizing northern railroads, the northern shipping industry, and the fishing industry, and things like this. So the South was paying, the South was 29% of the population, paying 82% of the taxes.
Interesting.
And a good 80% of the revenue of the federal government went for internal improvements in the North. So the South felt it was being used financially, and it was. And the Northern industrialists wanted even more. And you've also got to remember, Wall Street was heavily dependent on the South because the bankers loaned money to the Southern plantation owners. And they didn't take land as collateral very often because land was less valuable as slaves.
Sure.
The slave was
what would
the
they
collateral.
do with land? Yep.
Yeah. And the slave was a collateral. Well, what happens to your collateral if all the slaves are suddenly freed?
Your interest,
you don't have any.
Your bets are not covered. Yep.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Fascinating stuff. I encourage everyone to go out and get a copy. It wasn't about slavery. I wish you a lot of luck and success with the book, and I hope to have you on when your next book comes out as well, because I've really, really enjoyed reading. This is the first book of yours that I've read, and I've learned a lot. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you, DJ.
Yeah, come here, babe. Oh, what you got? Hey, come here. Oh, look in the camera. Hey, what's that? Say, please subscribe.
Please subscribe.
Yay! Say bye-bye. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. That was fun. Good job.